Our second reading this morning comes from the 32nd chapter of Exodus. In popular thought, the Ten Commandments are given to Moses in tablet form, but in the actual Exodus story, the commandments themselves are spoken directly to all the people of Israel. Afterwards, God begins to give all the other various commands and regulations for the covenant people to Moses and to Aaron. And then finally, Moses is invited up the mountain with God, where God has prepared tablets with all this information on them. But Moses has been up there now for weeks, and the people are becoming frightened and worried when we come to our reading for this morning. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to Yahweh." They rose early the next day and burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. Yahweh said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" Yahweh said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation." But Moses implored Yahweh his God and said, "O Yahweh, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth?' Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And Yahweh changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Just prior to graduating from seminary, I attended a sort of pastor job fair that's called Face to Face. This two-day event brought together scores of pastor nominating committees, along with well over 100 pastors and seminary students who were seeking calls. It was a hectic experience interviewing with a different church every hour for the whole day. There was some sort of matching that went on that was supposed to put compatible candidates with compatible churches. Seminary students like myself, for example, would not have been matched up with larger churches that were seeking an experienced pastor, and so on. Despite this, though, I had more than my share of interviews where 60 seconds in, you knew this was never going to happen. Still, I was new to the searching for a call game, and so these interviews were good practice. In one such interview, the conversation somehow turned to the topic of biblical authority. This was a conservative rural congregation. And when my answer included a comment about how the Bible sometimes became an idol, I could see a look of horror go across some of their faces. And the interview turned decidedly colder. How dare I compare the Bible to an idol like the golden calf? I've heard about the golden calf since I was a small child. There was a picture of it in the Bible story book that my father used to read to us. And along with the other idols that I heard about from the Bible, I understood the calf to be a replacement, an alternative to God, a competitor, something one chose rather than God. And some idols are, in fact, alternatives to God. But Aaron, the man who conceives, designs, and builds the calf, does not seem to understand it in that way. After he is finished with it, he says, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to Yahweh," not to Baal or Marduk or some other Near Eastern god, but to Yahweh, the God who brought them up out of Egypt, the God who had worked through this man, Moses. But Moses had disappeared, gone missing for weeks. The Israelites needed something more reliable, some way of invoking God, ensuring God would be there for them when they needed help. And so they turned to Moses' brother, Aaron, the priest. Now, true, Aaron is breaking one of the commandments that God had spoken to Israel just weeks before. You shall not make for yourselves an idol. The word can also mean an image. That whether it is in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or on earth below, or in the water beneath the earth. But these were desperate times. Moses gone. God absent. The Israelites needed something reliable. They needed something. I'm not sure why a calf, but apparently it fit the bill. Most of us have been there with the Israelites. We may never have been worried about dying in the wilderness, but we've been scared, we've been anxious, and wish that God were more available to us, wish God were there. Golden calves are not really in our repertoire, but we know ways to make God more accessible, available, manageable. As I mentioned to that pastor nominating committee, some folks carry a Bible around with them, God at the ready, a quick answer for every situation. I don't think that's the typical Presbyterian idol, though. I think most of us are more prone to construct a God to our liking, a God that acts in ways that we prefer. We may draw a few attributes for this God from the Scriptures, but we are quite selective. Very often the God we design is a kindly deity who would never hurt a fly. With this God, there's not much in the way of judgment, no fear of the Lord. This God looks like what we think is reasonable and possible. This God looks like what God would look like if we were God. Unfortunately, these gods that we construct for ourselves are very often impotent, powerless, unable to do very much at all except perhaps give us a spiritual warm fuzzy. When Israel and Aaron construct a God to suit them, Yahweh, the real deal, is not amused. Yahweh is ready to disown Israel and says to Moses, "Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. Now let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation." Yahweh's done with them. They're Moses' people now. God proposes to transfer the promises spoken to Abraham all those centuries ago to Moses. God will simply start over. If we are to take this story seriously at all, we must wrestle with some real difficulties. The God we see here contemplates wiping out Israel, destroying Israel, but Moses gets in the way. Moses functions as a sort of Christ figure here, standing in the breach between Israel and God. But can we really envision a God who Moses must somehow convince to relent? There's a similar problem with formulaic expressions of salvation, where Jesus stands in the breach between us and God. In such thinking, God is all set to judge and to punish, but Jesus somehow gets in between and saves us. But is this a true picture of God? A God all set to exercise wrath, but then dissuaded by Moses or by Jesus? I wonder if what we witness in the story of the golden calf and in the story of the cross doesn't reveal to us a profound conflict in the very heart of God. The God of the Bible will not let us finally decide on a God of mercy or a God of judgment. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann writes, "This tension of mercy that forgives and sovereignty that will not be mocked is an endless adjudication for the God of the Bible, who permits no final or systematic resolve. It is a tension that we all know in our most intimate and treasured relations. In Exodus, the crisis is kept raw, alive, and unresolved. It must be kept so for Moses and for Israel, as it is even for God's own life." The God that Brueggemann speaks of here is probably a little uncomfortable for some of us, but problematic for those of us who want our God to be predictable, logically consistent, never doing anything unexpected. But the God that we find in Exodus and at the cross is a dynamic, living God with a vitality absent in the gods we construct in our idols. Now, those of you who know that this is supposed to be a stewardship sermon may be wondering what exactly it is that I'm doing. And I have to admit that this text does seem to have drugged me away from my original sermon plans. But I do think the text has something to say about stewardship, more precisely about the anemic giving that is the norm in mainline congregations and in our denomination. Despite biblical language of a tithe, of giving the first 10% to God, Presbyterians give, on average, somewhere between 1.5% and 2.5%. That giving was actually 3.5% at the height of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And those giving averages are actually skewed upward by older members who are loyal and committed institutional supporters. Now, there are many reasons for this decline in giving to churches. Of a loss of faith in institutions like the church. An explosion of charitable options over the last 50 years, and many more. But I wonder if at least part of the reason isn't connected to the puny little gods we construct for ourselves. These gods, they are capable of little, and they ask even less. They do not inspire awe, much less obedience. Why would I dedicate a significant share of my time and energy, a large portion of my income and wealth, my very life, to such a puny, impotent God? Like the golden calf, the gods we construct for ourselves are not really meant to replace God so much as to make God accessible and manageable. We still speak of Jesus. We still read the sacred stories now and then. But our Jesus and our God are tame and domesticated, confined to their proper place at the very edges of our lives. Oh, how I would love to meet the God of Sinai, the Jesus of the cross, a real deity where God is the subject and I am object, a real God that makes me want to bow down and worship. I wonder, could that actually happen? If I tossed out the idol I construct for myself. All praise and glory to the God of Sinai, the God of Jesus, the God who calls us to new life and giving our life to the way of the cross. Thanks be to God.